Chapter 2. Mom. You're acting very strange, you're starting to scare me. Without saying much other than hold on a minute, Mrs. Sanchez just drove, heading into Craig from Ridgeview. Let's go to the city park and sit at one of the picnic tables by the Yempa River. Looking directly at her daughters, eyes off of the road for a moment, she continued. Let's just get comfy because I've got a lot to talk to you about. Alright? Sounds like I'm in trouble. No honey, you didn't do anything wrong. Just hold on a moment. Mrs. Sanchez continued and then turned back to face the road. After they pulled into a parking space at the park, Karina's mom pulled a metal box out of her purse before they stepped out of the car. What's that you're carrying, Mom? Karina asked as they approached a picnic table that was secluded away from the others. Oh, just a few things that I'll need to show you to collaborate what I'm gonna tell you. Now you're really scaring me. Don't worry, I'm a nervous wreck just trying to decide how to tell you what I've dragged you all the way out here for. As they reached the table, Mrs. Sanchez quickly covered her face with both hands. Well, just say it, Mom. Honey. You're gonna think that I've lost all of my marbles. Mom. I'm listening. Just blurt it out, then we can take it from there. Karina put her hand on her mother's hand as she tried to make her relax. Alright, I'll shoot from the hip. Karina, your great-grandpa, Miguel Sanchez, is a vampire. As the words left Mrs. Sanchez's mouth, she, once again, covered her face. Mom. A vampire? Like I said, you'll think that I've lost my marbles. Then, as she finished speaking, she uncovered her face and opened the box. One item at a time, Karina's mother pulled out many pieces of paper and then laid them out on the table. All right, Karina. I know you've grown up with the thought, and most people do, that vampires are only a myth or only science fiction. This is why it's hard for me to explain this stuff to you. Picking up a family tree out of the rest of the paper, she handed it to her daughter. Okay. This is a family tree, Mom. As Karina looked at the family tree, she could see that it covered generations as far back as the late 1300s. Then Mrs. Sanchez pulled out a couple old newspaper articles that dated back to the 1300s as well. As Karina looked at these articles, she noticed that some were the names, within the family tree, were also mentioned within the articles. These articles specified murders of death that were blamed on those within the family tree. Then Karina's mom pulled out some old picture of family members that showed protruding canine teeth that were the supposed weapon of the deaths indicated. There were some pictures of the same people, and children, that had also been shown with the protruding teeth. Mom, they could all be made up to look this way. Honey, what you see is true. And also, remember your dreams. How else would you have had knowledge of your great-grandfather? Also, remember that you've been scared of him in the dreams. Then, reaching out to Karina's hand, she continued. I didn't put two and two together in regards to your dreams until you identified your great-grandfather, Karina. I used to have nightmares about him too. It's in our blood. And this is why I chose to only have one child. To reduce the chance of having another killing caused by our family. This is why Grandpa Arnofonso only had one child too, reduce the chance of harm being done. Karina started to think about what Dr. Knox had found in regards to Malachi's teeth. His canines growing prior to birth. Mom, we can't tell David about this. I don't want him thinking that we're crazy. I cannot tell him. Well, honey, that's your choice, however, I still think that he has the right to know. Then, pulling her hands back from Karina, she picked up the papers, placing them back into the box. I know what you're saying, Mom, but I think that as long as this doesn't affect us personally, that it would be just best that we don't give David anything to worry about. Saying this, she had also realized that her own mother had no clue about the findings with Malachi's teeth. Besides that, Mom, it obviously doesn't affect every generation. Looking at her daughter, she almost had a feeling that Karina was hiding something from her. Are you sure that everything is alright, Karina? Yeah. Of course, Mom. I just don't think that we should cause alarm when there's a good chance that there's not anything to worry. Well, what are you gonna tell David when he asks what was so important? I don't know. I'll think of something like some family tragedy that involved Grandpa Miguel Sanchez. Then, thinking to herself for a moment, that isn't far off from the truth anyway. I'll tell him that you wanted to talk about it to me. That'll work. On the way back to Riju, Karina thought real hard about the findings with Malachi. The more that she thought about it, the more a combination of fear and curiosity began to overwhelm her mind. How could all of this be true? Then, how could her mom, or why would her mom, come up with such a story? Then have paperwork to back up her claims? It was true that her mom was a single child, it was also true that Karina herself was a single child. Then Malachi. Should she go on with a dentist appointment? Or, would it be best that they just avoided all dentist? No. David would know that something is wrong, then begin to ask questions. Karina. Abruptly Karina looked over to her mom. I just called your name 3 times, honey. We're here, you can go on in and tell David whatever it is that you think will work. I love you, Mom, Karina said as she opened the door. Please, Mom, please don't repeat any of this to anyone. I'll tell David that Miguel Sanchez was in a terrible accident that you wanted to talk to me about. Hopefully he won't question any further than just that. All right, sweetie. I love you too. If that's the story that you're gonna tell David, we'll stick to it. Tell me what? Jumping nearly completely off the ground, Karina turned real quick as she didn't hear her husband come up behind her. About an accident that Grandpa Miguel Sanchez was in many years ago that Mom wanted to talk to me about. And now, after over 100 years after he's been dead, you're having dreams about him. David believed what his wife was saying but couldn't make sense of her dreams. We love you, Mom. We'll talk to you later, David said to Mrs. Sanchez. Then, as Karina's mother drove out of sight, her and David both went back into the apartment. As they went into the apartment, the aroma of cooked ground beef filled the air. What are you cooking, honey? Karina asked. I thought that hamburger helper would sound good for dinner. Then David hugged Karina before heading back into the kitchen. As David continued to prepare supper, Karina decided to go and check on Malachi. After entering the room, she found that Malachi was awake and was looking at her as she approached his crib. Hi honey, how are you doing? Using just the tip of her finger, she tickled Malachi's belly, causing him to giggle. Karina couldn't help but to stare at his gums as he smiled back. Then, picking up his bottle that laid next to him, she carefully inserted the nipple into his mouth. I love you, Malachi. It's time for you to take a nap. Then as she quietly backed herself out of the room, she whispered the words to Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. David and Karina made it on time to the appointment on June 2nd. Though it was determined that Malachi was still healthy, it was also noted that his body temperature was still extremely low. Also, Malachi's teeth had not changed either. With the anointment, however, another discovery was made. Dr. Knox discovered 2 holes in the roof of Malachi's mouth. These holes, about 1/8 of an inch in diameter, were located directly behind where the partially developed canine teeth would be. One on each side. Because of the fact that Malachi's canine teeth hadn't broken through the skin yet, probably wouldn't for some time yet, the holes in the roof of Malachi's mouth were obvious after being pointed out by the doctor. Your son is barely 2 weeks old yet, the issues involving his teeth is extremely odd, however, I don't see any reason to worry about LT. It's possible that the holes in his mouth could fill in on their own, at any rate though we need to take extra care to make sure that his mouth is always clean. Dr. Knox hadn't really shown alarm, therefore Karina decided that the secret would be best to remain a secret. Karina had gone back to work at the Craig Police Department with reduced hours. The reduction at hours was at her own request so that she would be able to be at home with Malachi. Larry Wallace, Karina's police chief, and her regular partner, Kim Nay, had regularly visited Dave and Karina at their home so that they could see the baby. Larry Wallace, just as he had made the wooden rocking horse, had also made a picture frame, made of solid oak, for all of the pictures that had been taken since Malachi's birth. The picture frame had made a wonderful addition to Malachi's bedroom wall. For the most part, David had continued to work full-time at the Craig City Hall. He had taken some days off to match the days that Karina couldn't be replaced at work. Bill, Patty, and Mrs. Sanchez had, as usual, made a regular point to visit their children. Also, as usual, Karina and Dave had made their rounds to their parents' house as well. In about May of 1999, as Malachi was about to reach his first birthday, he had started to walk, to some extent. Malachi had a habit of starting out at a walk, but then only moments later he would be crawling. Malachi had now a vocabulary at about 24 words. First two learned of course were Mama and Dada and then Grandpa and Nana. For a 12-month-old these would be considered as the usual rate at learning. It was also about this time period that Malachi had started to get his first few teeth. Most children would get a few incisors first. With Malachi, however, his first two teeth were his canine teeth on the top. For a long time it would seem that these two teeth were all that would grow. It wasn't long after these two teeth grew into place that Mrs. Sanchez had pulled her daughter to the side. "Karina, you know what this means, don't you?" "Yes, Mom. But I'm trying to just not think about it." With her answer, Karina looked down at the floor and then every few seconds peered at her from the corner of her eye. "Karina, I'm not saying that something has to be done or said about it. All that I'm saying, honey, is that we need to take some preventive measures. Not right now either. What I'm talking about is when Malachi gets old enough for kindergarten, and then has sleepovers. You know as well as I do that Malachi's peers may just fall victim to your son. Mom, we don't know what's gonna happen 4 and 5 years from now." Bending over to pick Malachi up as he stumbled at her feet, she embraced him tightly. "I love you, Malachi." "I love you too." Malachi responded in the best manner that he could. Then, turning to face his grandmother, "I love you, Nana." "I'll love you too, Malachi," Mrs. Sanchez said, then bent toward him and kissed him on the forehead. "I love you very much, my grandson." Malachi responded by laughing real loud and raising both of his little hands to his forehead, almost as if he was embarrassed by the kiss. "Malachi, do you want to kiss Grandma?" Karina played. At first Malachi made a loud laugh and then slowly bent his body forward, toward his grandmother, puckered up and then laid an extremely wet kiss on Mrs. Sanchez's cheek. 0 hours no. Malachi's grandmother playfully shouted. "You've slimmed me." At the sudden outburst Malachi started to laugh loudly. Then, he bent himself toward his mother and slimmed her forehead. The playing went back and forth until before long the issue of Malachi's biological being was completely pushed aside. The fact is that Mrs. Sanchez did love her grandson, yet she couldn't help but to worry about the relevance of her own childhood nightmares, Karina's nightmares, and of course, the knowledge or their family tree. After all, Malachi was only a child. He could be raised just the same as any other child. Couldn't he? Periodically there were questions in regards to what if involving the genetics of Malachi. Through each one, however, the results had turned out to be on constructive points and how to avoid both problems and others learning about Malachi. Karina had decided that the only doctor appointments that would be made for Malachi are those that were emergencies and also those that would be required for school. Public schooling would be their choice at the time. Along with these choices it was also decided that David would, still, not be let in on the family secret. The choice, for Karina anyhow, was not easy, being that David is Malachi's father. The secret would only be between her mother and herself. "Hey Malachi. Come to Mom," Karina called to her son one morning. Malachi had just gotten to his feet after tripping over a fold in a throw-down rug that laid on the apartment floor between the living room and the kitchen. "Come on honey," Karina continued. Malachi had fallen hard when he had his spill. Then, as he slowly waddled his way towards his mom, he began to cry. "Mommy. I hurt my cheek." Through sobs he pointed to the left side of his mouth. Then, just as he reached his mother, he began to stumble over her feet as he raised his arms indicating that he wanted to be picked up. "What's wrong with your cheek, honey?" With pity in her voice she picked her son up and then laid him down on his back over her legs as she sat on the couch. "Let me see your cheek, Malachi." Pointing at his own cheek, "See mama," he said as he, once again, pointed at his cheek. "The floor." "Just hold still for a second, hun." Karina interrupted her son for a moment. Karina couldn't see any sign of injury to Malachi's cheek. Then, after putting her finger into his mouth, she carefully felt the ridges of his gum line, periodically checking her finger for blood. She carefully examined Malachi's 2 partially developed canine teeth to make sure that he hadn't knocked them loose. While doing this she couldn't help but to notice that these 2 teeth seemed as though they were getting longer and sharper. Using her index finger of her other hand, she carefully pried Malachi's mouth open further so that she could see the roof of his mouth. As she carefully looked inside, trying her best to not choke her son, she looked at the 2 holes that were directly behind his 2 canine teeth. "Well, Malachi, I don't see any blood, honey. Would you like me to kiss your cheek?" "Mama." "Kiss Malachi, oh." Pointing to the same place on his cheek as he had before, he smiled with glee as he waited for his kiss. Then, after kissing him, he started to laugh as he also immediately began to wiggle his legs and lower body in an attempt to get down on the floor. Malachi's first birthday was a highlight for, not only David and Karina, but for Malachi as well. Patty, Bill, Mrs. Sanchez, and Corina's old teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had all gathered together for the celebration at the city park. The birthday party lasted for about 3 hours. During that time Malachi had managed to make a mess out of the frosting, and then had gotten ice cream all over himself and a girl that had come along named Nicole that was 5 years old. Nicole was neighbors with David and Karina. In fact, she had lived in an apartment right next door to the Declus. Since Malachi was born, Nicole had often acted as an older sister to Malachi. Regardless of the mess that Malachi had created, there was a lot of joy within the celebration. Soon, and well known to David and Karina, it would be time for another dental appointment with Dr. Knox. Though Karina was being careful to make the true dental issues with Malachi a secret, she had changed her mind on the urgency of dental appointments. She had decided that Malachi's health was important enough to her to see to it that all of his medical needs were met. She felt that most people, just as she had just a year prior, would not put 2 and 2 together, making Malachi out to be a vampire. By the time that July had rolled around, Malachi had all of his first set of teeth in place. With an exception of the 2 upper canine teeth, the rest of his teeth looked just the same as any other child's first set of teeth. It wasn't before long that most of the issues regarding Malachi's health and dental had been put to rest between Karina and her mother. Once in a while, however, and only after someone else had said something about the size of his canine teeth, the issue would come up and then quickly swept back under the carpet. The dreams that Karina had grown up with still haunted her. Only difference is that now the only 2 characters that she didn't know are the 2 children. Miguel Sanchez, whom of course is the older guy within the nightmares, seemed to continue being the monster that often awoke Karina in the middle of the night. As said before, Karina felt that she was supposed to protect the 2 children. Now, however, she had also felt that there was something that she had to protect the children as well. Now, that Malachi had all of his teeth, she had felt that it was time for family pictures to be done professionally at Kmart. Then, on a Friday that her and Dave had both off of work, the 3 of them went and had their very first set of professional family photos done. The experience that they had at Kmart that Friday morning was a moment that would most likely never be forgotten. Malachi didn't only pose real good for the picture, but he had also, in a sense, showed off in front of the camera. His actions made David, Karina, and the photographer all laugh as the young child enjoyed the moment. A moment that was often a scary moment for other kids his own age. Compared to most children Malachi's age, 14 months, he seemed to be in a very happy and energized state of mind all the time. It was as if Malachi had gotten a natural high out of life. Full of smiles, hardly cried, as most children his age do, and, as he got older, he was extremely polite to all people in general. Even at the age of 14 months it was yes sir and thank you ma'am. The neighbor girl, Nicole, whom was 4 years older than Malachi, had made herself, originally, a teacher or older sister to Malachi. Now, however, the young girl had found herself being more of a student and best friends to Malachi. This display of respect made all heads turn when the 2 were at play. There were some days that Malachi had acted no different than any other child his age. Of course, regardless of how respectful he was to others, he was still a child. A very young child that had, like anyone else, woken up on the wrong side of the bed at times. On 4th of July of 1999 David and Karina had taken Malachi to the Moffat County Fairgrounds to watch the fireworks. This was an exciting thing for the kid, however, he had jumped at every loud boom. Malachi liked the bright colored lights that flashed across the sky and had pointed at many of the firework rockets as he could see them shoot high into the sky. Both of his parents were surprised at Malachi's ability to see the tiny rockets from their point of view. It was shortly after Malachi's first 4th of July that Karina had started to rely on the use of babysitters for Malachi so that they could go back to their normal work schedules. The schedules that they had once worked prior to Karina becoming pregnant. Larry Wallace hadn't pushed the issue about the work hours, however. Her former partner had transferred to the Colorado State Highway Patrol, which had left the department short of employees. She had personally responded by making a commitment to the department as she decided to work regular shifts plus overtime. Mrs. Sanchez and Bill and Patty had often took turns babysitting their grandson. This was a good thing for Malachi and for the grandparents as well. This gave the grandparents a chance to bring themselves closer to the child. Bill: I wish that David and Karina would get something done about Malachi's teeth. These two top teeth are much longer than the others, and sooner or later people are going to start teasing him by calling him a vampire or something. Oh, don't worry about it, Patty. The kids aren't going to make something out of two of his teeth being longer than the rest. Besides that, I'm sure that other kids have some differences that are much different than the deformation of some teeth. I don't know. All know is that you can see these teeth from a mile away. I'm also surprised that he hasn't accidentally bitten himself. Ooh. Just the sound of that hurts. The kid will be just fine, honey. Leave it alone. There were times that Miss Henderson had also volunteered to watch Malachi as well. The old lady was excited when Karina and Dave had told her that they would be more than happy to let her watch him. Miss Henderson had often bought little things such as crayons and coloring books for Malachi to color in. At one point she had even bought finger paint for Malachi. This ended up later being a mistake, as one day Malachi had decided to paint a big picture of his parents on the wall next to Miss Henderson's kitchen table. Just prior to Halloween of 1999, David and Karina had decided to buy a puppy for their son. The price was a little high, yet the pet store had pushed it upon them, talking about how good of a deal it was, and then backed it up by handing the puppy to Malachi. Instantly he had gotten attached to the dog and then started to say that he wanted a puppy. Mama. Dada. Can I have this puppy? He likes me. As David and Karina watched Malachi interact with the dog, he laughed and giggled as the young Chinese pug licked Malachi in the face. Well, I don't know. $700 is pretty expensive for a pooch that's gonna poop all over the place, get into the trash, and tear up the couch. Well, sir, that all depends on how you bring the puppy up. If you allow the puppy to do all of that, then most likely that is exactly what he will do. The pet store employee said. The way that the employee was acting was offending David in a way that had made him decide to walk out of the pet store. Leaving his wife and son behind, on his way out, he whispered into Karina's ear to go ahead and get the puppy for Malachi. Karina did as he told her, paid the $700, but then before leaving the pet store requested to be allowed to speak to the owner or manager of the store as well. Ma'am, you had no right to talk to my husband in the matter that you just did. Now give me the name and phone number to your supervisor. But I was only playing. Mrs. DeClue. I didn't mean any harm by my joking. I'm only going to say this one last time. Then, as an officer of the law, I will then close the doors of this business until I personally speak to the owner. Do you understand me? Karina said in a very low tone. All right. I'm sorry. The clerk said, then handed the business card of the owner to Karina. What happened that took so long? David asked as his wife and son came walking out of the store about 15 minutes later. Oh, not much. I told the crazy women to give me the number of the owner so that I could make a complaint, or I would shut down the business until I was given the opportunity to speak to the owner. She gave me his business card and then apologized. Malachi had walked out right behind his mother carrying the puppy on a leash that was brightly colored in neon pink. The puppy seemed to be just as happy as Malachi as it pranced around with its tongue hanging out of its mouth and jumping up onto Malachi, almost knocking him over. Well, David started as he watched the puppy. I hope that the dog turns out to be worth the money. I'm sure that it will, hun. We were patient when Malachi made mistakes. I'm sure that we can do it for the dog also. Besides that, he is cute. I know I am. But I thought that we were talking about the puppy, David said as he quickly got his sense of humor back in order. Now Malachi. What do you say to your mom for getting you the puppy? Thank you, mama. I wow you, mama and dada, Malachi said as the new addition of their family started to pull him along. What do you think that we should name your puppy, Malachi? How about puppy? The child spoke up quickly. No. Silly boy, that isn't a name, Karina said as she raked her fingers through Malachi's hair. I don't know. How about Nana? No, not Grandma. A name for a dog, not a person. Honey. David interrupted. It looks like a potato all shriveled up. Yeah, you're right. Malachi, how about we name the puppy Spud? Okay. That sounds good. Malachi responded. Hey Spud, I like you. Hey Mom, can we take Spud home with us? Well, of course. That's why we got him, silly, Karina said as she bent over to pick Spud up off of the floor. Malachi's second year of life was very similar to his first, and for the most part just the same as any other child of his age. Questions were often asked about Malachi's teeth, the canines that were very obvious, then promptly the questions were giving an excuse that would sound good to that particular moment. L1 City. Go ahead L1. Be advised that I'll be 1076 and en route to my residence for lunch. 10-4 L1. City clear at 11:45. The weather that year in Craig, Colorado was very unusually warm and dry. On this particular day, Karina's husband had chose to stay home with Malachi rather than sending the child to the babysitter's apartment. Hi honey. David announced as Karina walked into the apartment door. Hello. How's everything going so for today? David had always thought that Karina looked good in uniform. Then again, out of uniform or without anything for that matter. Oh, not much. Your mother called earlier and asked if we would like to come over to her house for dinner. Well, that sounds good to me. You don't have any other plans for that matter, Karina continued. At the sound of his mother's voice, Malachi came out of his bedroom rubbing both eyes with his fists as he fought to wake up. Hi Mommy. Hi sweetie. You look tired, Karina said as she bent over to pick her son up off of the floor. Embracing her son, she held onto him momentarily until she felt him rest his head and her shoulder. Oh no honey. It's not time for you to go to sleep in my arms right now. Mommy's got to go back to work. No. Mommy, please stay here. I miss you Mommy. Walking up to his wife, David peeled his son off of Karina's chest and then held him over his own shoulder. Well buddy, it looks like that you're about ready to go back to bed, David said quietly into his son's ear. No daddy. I want to stay with you guys. With this, Malachi started to cry. All right, you don't have to go back to bed. But your mom needs to eat and then go back to work. Okay? All right. The young child answered. Are you having a bad day, Malachi? Karina asked as she pulled some lunch meat out of the refrigerator. I had a bad dream. An old guy was chasing me. As the words came out of Malachi's mouth, he momentarily started to cry again. Oh yeah, David interrupted, why was the old man chasing you? I don't know. Once again Malachi started to rub his eyes as he yawned. Karina stopped for a moment as she listened to her son talk about his bad dream. Oh my God. I hope that he's not having the same dreams that I grew up with. That would be about the last thing that we need. As she finished putting her sandwich together, she took a large bite out of it. What's the chance of him having the same dreams that you're having, honey? We have never talked to Malachi about your dreams. As David said this, she instantly remembered that David had no clue about the fact that her mother had also had the same dreams. Well honey. I'm sure that it will be okay. Karina assured her son. Her lunch break lasted for about 30 minutes before she headed back onto road patrol. Then as she left the apartment complex, she decided to go and visit her mother before heading back to work. City L1. Go ahead L1. I'll be 10-8, 1034 to 890 Finley Lane for welfare check. 10-4 L1. City clear at 12:22. Karina wondered for a moment rather if the dispatcher would have realized that she was headed over to her own mother's house. Yet, at the same time she felt that she had to let her mom know that it was possible that her grandson was now having the nightmares. Just as Karina pulled up to the intersection of Finley Lane and 9th Street, she saw her mom coming out the front door of her house. As she made a U-turn in the intersection with the patrol car, her mother turned and looked as Karina began to pull into the drive. "Well, nice to see you, honey," Mrs. Sanchez said with a lot of joy in her voice. "Did you get my message?" "Yes, I did, Mom. And thank you, we'll take you up on your invitation." Then, as she closed the door to the patrol car, she continued, "Mom, I think that there is a problem." "Well, what is it, dear?" the older woman asked as her face went blank. "I think that Malachi is having the nightmares that you and I both grew up with." "Oh no. Are you sure?" "Well, I just went home to have lunch with David, and while I was there Malachi had woken up from his nap. He had said something about having a nightmare of which included an old man chasing him. Mom, this character in his dreams had scared him. This is why I think that it's the same dreams." "Well, honey, there isn't really anything that we can do rather if it is the same dreams or not. The best that you can do, as his mother, is listen to him when he wakes up crying and wants to talk about it. That's what I've done with you. And that's what your grandfather, Arnofonso, did with me. Just be there for him. Then, when you can, ask him questions about the dreams. That way you can counsel him over them. Yeah. That's what you've done with me. I was just hoping that my son wouldn't grow up with the same bullshit that I grew up with, Mom." "I know, dear. But as I've told you that first day when you were able to identify your grandpa Miguel Sanchez, it's in the blood. And of course you know that Malachi is another vamp." "Okay, Mom. Please don't remind me," Karina interrupted. "I'm just scared of the whole thing." "Scared? Honey, this subject hasn't even came up in nearly a year. Why are you suddenly scared again? You know what is going on with your son, Karina. Don't let yourself go back and forth of being afraid of something that you can't do anything about. It's in our blood, hun. Get used to it." Karina left after about 15 minutes and then went back out on patrol. She was scared, and yet, like her mother had told her, she knew very well that there was nothing that she could do about it. If anything, she felt worse after talking to her mother than she did before she left her own apartment. About a week later, on Malachi's second birthday, Karina and David had both decided to take the day off of work and spend that day with their son at the Craig City Park. The city park had a swimming pool, a kiddie pool, and also a wave pool that had been installed back in the mid-80s. Karina and David knew very well that their son enjoyed the shallow end of the wave pool as he often played with the other kids his own age. "Well, Karina, I called the dentist this morning and got an appointment set up for Malachi. You know, it's hard to describe the feeling that I get sometimes when someone teases Malachi about his teeth." As David mentioned teasing, she turned her attention off of her son and looked at her husband. "Who's teasing him?" she asked, interrupting her husband. "Oh. Just kids in general. I took Malachi with me to the grocery store a couple of mornings ago, while you were at work, and while we were in the store a couple of kids, maybe about 5 or 6 years old, started to point at Malachi and tease him about his teeth. I think that it's time that we look into doing something about it." "What do you think that we can do that we aren't already doing, honey?" "We are already doing everything that we can." "I know. It's just not fair how kids can be so mean." David. Unfortunately, it's not illegal to be an asshole. As for the appointment with the dentist, however, it is about time anyhow now that his birthday is here. With this said, Karina just quietly turned her attention back to her son as he continued to enjoy the moment with other kids. "The appointment isn't until next week," David said as he turned to look at his son as well. Instantly Malachi began to splash water at another kid next to him. "Malachi, you be nice now. You know better than splashing water at people." Just as he said this, the kid that Malachi had splashed suddenly returned the wet joke by jumping real hard into the water right next to him. In response, Malachi had gotten a look on his face, like as if he was going to cry, and then quickly splashed the kid again. "Well, the upside to the teasing is that Malachi is starting to fight back," Karina said, and then thought to herself that she had hoped that her son would never learn to bite someone like many kids do. It was just a couple of days after Malachi's second birthday that his parents took him for another dental appointment. Though David was the one to personally push the issue, regardless of the fact that Karina swore that there was no need to worry, Soon enough the 2-year-old was once again sitting in front of Dr. Knox. Dr. Knox was a bit disturbed by the enlargement of the canines on Malachi's upper jaw. "I just don't understand, even through all of my medical training, how this could be possible. I swear, I would have to start believing in vampires." "Well, as we all know, Dr. Knox, vampires are only myth. I'm sure that we don't have to worry about anything," Karina said as she tried to fit a grin on her face with her attempt of humor. "Besides, we all know that vampires don't really exist." "Yeah. But with this kid you could get people to look into the myth a lot deeper." "Mommy. What are vampires?" Malachi suddenly interrupted. "Nothing to worry about, Malachi," Karina snapped real quickly and then gave the doctor a glare that seemed, to Dr. Knox, to be threatening. "Hey Dr. Knox, isn't there any way that you could possibly just remove those 2 canines and then Malachi would look just the same as any other child? After all, there has been a lot of teasing by other children when we go out anywhere." The look on Karina's face, a glare, had suddenly changed into a look of curiosity as the question came out of her husband's mouth. "That sounds like a good idea. Couldn't we do something like that?" Karina repeated. David. "Well, yeah. We could do something like that. Realize, however, that it may be hard for Malachi to correctly chew his food. And yes, then Malachi would look just the same as any other kid. On top of that, Malachi should grow his permanent teeth about the time that he turns 8 or 9 years old." Karina had stopped listening to what the doctor and David were saying. She had started to think about the idea that maybe the idea of removing Malachi's teeth, would put an end to the family history. The history, involving vampires, that is. "Well, I can start removing these teeth right now. All right?" Dr. Knox said as he tried to get Karina's attention as she seemed to be daydreaming. "Karina, are you listening to what the doctor is saying?" David said loudly enough that it caused his wife to jump to attention. "Yeah. I hear him. It sounds like a great idea." Then, bending over to hug her son as he laid in the dentist's chair, she continued. "Okay, Malachi. Daddy and I will be waiting just outside that door." As she said this to her son, she kissed him on the forehead and pointed towards the door as she spoke. "I love you, buddy. I love you too, Mommy and Dada." Malachi cheerfully spoke up. As David and Karina both stepped out the door, David lightly put his hand on his wife's shoulder. "Honey. Why did you get so upset towards the doctor? He was just making an observation. He didn't mean for us to take that as an insult. The fact is that Malachi does look like a vampire. And as he gets older it may become worse if we don't do something about it now. I don't know what came over me, honey. I guess that I just don't like anyone, especially an adult, teasing a helpless child, especially our son." "Well, that's understandable. Do me a favor though and apologize to the doctor before we leave today. It may help if you just let him know that we are constantly dealing with other children doing the teasing anytime that we go out into public." Karina just stood there and thought about the fact that most of today's society does only see vampires as a myth rather than something that is real. "The fact is, honey, I don't know. Yeah, right, I'll apologize for my behavior. I was wrong." Surprisingly, the appointment took about 3 hours. Then when Malachi and the doctor came out of the examination room, Dr. Knox had a smile on his face and Malachi's mouth looked extremely swollen as he clung onto the dentist's hand. "Well, we were successful. Now I've got his top gum line packed with gauze for right now. That gauze will need to stay in his mouth for the rest of the day." Then, reaching up into a cabinet, Dr. Knox pulled out a new box of gauze and handed it to David. "You need to change this gauze before you eat. Then, before he goes to bed. And then when you do put him into the bed, don't have anything in his mouth at all. Obviously this would be a choking hazard. Then, as soon as he gets up in the morning, repack the gauze. If he is still bleeding come lunchtime, do the same thing, pull out the gauze and then replace it after he eats. Also, reaching into a drawer, I'm going to write out this prescription for Malachi. LTS for amoxicillin. Just prior to each time that you repack the gauze, give Malachi 2 tablespoons of it. Then, when the bleeding has stopped, give Malachi the 2 tablespoons in the morning and then again at night." Taking the prescription from the doctor, Karina smiled. "Thank you, Dr. Knox. And also I'm sorry for my attitude earlier. It's just that we are dealing with a lot of teasing from other people directed towards Malachi because of his teeth. I'm sorry. It's alright, Karina. Elle probably should have bitten my tongue. Elle was being a bit short of being professional. I'm the one that should be saying I'm sorry. With that said, David bent down and picked Malachi up off of the floor. Well, gee there, buddy, you are starting to look like a squirrel with those cheeks packed like that, David joked. Malachi tried to say something to his father but couldn't manage to open his mouth without a bloody smear of saliva running down his chin. Putting his hand on the back of Malachi's head, he carefully hugged him as Malachi laid his head into the side of his father's neck. I know you're tired, son. We're gonna head home now. All right? With his question, David could feel Malachi nodding his head in a positive response to the question. As the three of them walked out of the dental office, they remained quiet for a moment. Honey, let's stop by my folks' house for a quick visit. All right by me. I'm just happy to get out of Dr. Knox's office, David said. I think that just being in the dentist's office makes me feel nervous. The only doctor that there is that when they say that it's not gonna hurt, it always does, and then when they say it will hurt, it ends up being the most painless procedure that there is. As David went silent for a moment, he carefully placed Malachi into the child safety seat as Karina climbed into the front passenger seat. Yeah, you're right about that, David. The dentist is the only doctor that I've ever been scared of. Then, as they both drove up Finley Lane, periodically both David and Karina took turns looking over their shoulders to check on Malachi as he had fallen asleep just prior to David placing him in the seat. After pulling into Karina's mother's house, David picked their sleeping child out from the back seat as Karina shut the car door behind him and then quickly walked up the steps to the front door of the house. Hey Mom. Are you awake? Karina yelled up the short flight of steps. Yes honey. I'm in the kitchen. Come on up. Then, just moments later, as David had caught up with his wife, Mrs. Sanchez showed herself at the top of the steps. Oh my goodness. What happened? The older woman said as she cupped her hands in front of her own mouth. Nothing much. We just had those 2 teeth removed by Dr. Knox. David spoke up. Then, looking at her daughter, are you sure that that was a good idea, Karina? Mrs. Sanchez asked as she looked directly at her daughter. I don't see how it would hurt anything. Hell, if anything it should help the situation, Karina said, and then picked her son out of her husband's arms and then walked into the living room. What I'm asking, Karina, is are you sure that that was a good idea considering the situation? As she pushed the issue, she followed her daughter into the living room with David on her heels. What situation are you talking about? David interrupted. Then stood in the center of the room with both of his hands on his hips. Oh, nothing bad, Karina said real quickly. Just family history with bad teeth. With the answer, Karina stared into her mother's eyes, hoping that she remembers real quickly that David doesn't know the truth about the genetics of their family. Mrs. Sanchez did get the hint real fast and then walked out into the kitchen. Oh yeah, Karina, would you please, when you get a chance, go downstairs and put Malachi's toys into the closet? Putting her head back into the living room, she continued. I'm having some company tonight and I would like this place to be looking real clean before they get here. Yeah. Which closet, Mom? The red oak closet. The one that smells real nice. Then, after a moment, David looked at his wife. Are you sure that you and your mom aren't hiding something from me, Karina? Of course not, honey. I wouldn't hold anything back from you. You of all people should know that the best. As Karina headed down the stairs, David went into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee that Mrs. Sanchez had just brewed. David, there isn't anything that you have to worry about. Like Karina said, she couldn't hold anything important back from you. She loves you too much to do that. Soon the subject changed off of Malachi as he laid asleep on his grandmother's couch. Hey Mom. Karina called out as she began to come back up the stairs. Yeah, dear? I was just wondering. Who is coming over to visit you? You got a hot date or something? Not quite, silly. Just some old women and I are gonna play some cards tonight. You know it gets a bit lonely around here when you guys don't come and visit very often. Mom. David, Malachi, and I are here at least twice a week. Where do you get the idea that we don't come and visit very often? Karina asked. Well, I guess that you could say that I'm just not quite used to the idea of you living outside of the house. Mom. Karina interrupted. I've been living outside of the house for almost 3 years. You've never mentioned anything about being lonely. Why all of a sudden now? As Karina and her mother went back and forth, David took himself and his cup of coffee into the living room. As he carefully sat on the couch and picked up the telephone. Hey honey. David yelled out into the kitchen, accidentally startling Malachi. I'm calling my mom real quick. Okay. All right, David. Karina answered as she came around the corner of the living room, putting her right index finger to her lips. Though David hadn't wakened Malachi, he had immediately decided that he didn't want to wake the sleeping child either, and then decided to take the cordless phone out into the kitchen where his wife and Mrs. Sanchez were still talking. Hello. Patty had just gotten home when she had found that the phone was ringing. Running from the door, she was almost out of breath as she found that it was only David. Hi honey. I just got home from the grocery store with your dad. How did the dentist visit go today? Actually, Mom, the dentist visit went great. We ended up getting those long teeth removed. With an exception of all of the gauze in Malachi's mouth, he looks like any other child now. Well, that's great honey. David could hear his mother pull herself away from the phone as she was talking to his father in the background. David could hear her telling him about the removal of Malachi's teeth. Unfortunately, he could also hear his father respond by saying, "You're not supposed to fix something that isn't broken." Well honey. I'm proud of you for getting that taken care of. It's about time. That poor child of yours has heard enough of the bullshit from other kids. After pausing a moment, she continued. Hey David, sometime tonight, how about you, Karina and Malachi come over for dinner? It's been a while since we've seen you guys. Thinking to himself that Karina, Malachi, and himself must have taken a vacation without even knowing it, by the implication from both Mrs. Sanchez and now his mother saying that they haven't seen them in a long time, David asked, Mom, why is it that everyone says that we haven't been around lately? Hell, Karina and I were at your house just yesterday. And we were at Mrs. Sanchez's house just the day before. Honey. Just relax. I was just joking with you. Hell, maybe you should take a nap before you come over here. I'm sorry, Mom. This removal of Malachi's teeth just got me on edge. I'm sorry. Well, that's understandable, David. It's hard for the parents when such a traumatic operation takes place. Your dad had a problem when you had your first teeth removed. I thought for sure that your dad was going to punch the doctor. All right, Mom. We'll be over about. How about 7 o'clock? All right, 7 o'clock sounds good. And Dad and I will see you guys then. All right? Okay, Mom. I love you. I love you too, son. Bye now. As he got off of the phone, he found that both Karina and Mrs. Sanchez were staring at him. What's up? Oh, I was just wondering about the attitude towards your mother. That's all. Oh, that's nothing. This process with Malachi and the dentist just got me on the edge today. Seems stupid. I know. No. It's not stupid. You love your son. That's not stupid. A couple of weeks later, both Karina and David had taken the day off of work at the same time so that they could have a family day alone. With this idea in mind, all three of them loaded up into the car and decided that they were just gonna go sightseeing for the day. Well, where would you like to go, Karina? I don't know. How about the Dinosaur National Monument in Utah? Or maybe that national park in Rifle with the caves? Karina hadn't really had any particular place in mind. She knew that she had wanted to make it a family habit of making a regular sightseeing trip. What are caves, Mommy? Malachi piped up from the back seat. Looking back at her son, she could see that Malachi was trying to force his body forward, against his car seat belt, to try to hear his mother's explanation. Caves are holes in the side of the mountain, or sometimes a hole in the ground that people or animals used to live in years ago. That's funny, Malachi giggled. Why would people live in a hole, Mommy? Because they didn't have houses many years ago like we do now. With this David looked over towards his wife with a silly grin on his face. What? Oh, it's just kinda funny seeing you coming up with answers for him. It seems like just yesterday that we were the ones asking all of the questions. I know. It's kinda strange sometimes. With this they had decided to go and see the caves and rifle so that Malachi could see the answer to his own question. As Karina, David, and Malachi arrived at the park, there was an overhead sign that indicated the name of the park, and on that sign there was also a notice that no firearms were allowed in the state park. Well, at least we don't have to worry about that, David said as he looked at his wife. No, but I do wonder what prompted the sign to be posted in the first place. Who knows? Most likely just for the safety of the visitors in the park or for the safety of the wildlife. As David finished answering his wife, he noticed, through the rear-view mirror, that Malachi was poking and prodding at something within his mouth. Malachi, what's wrong? My new teeth real funny. The child answered promptly from the back seat. What do you mean new teeth, Malachi? Karina interrupted as she now turned to look at her son. When she looked into his mouth, Malachi was pointing at the area of teeth that were removed. Honey, move your finger. I can't see what you're talking about. Right here, he said as he pointed one last time. Then, as she looked very carefully, she could see the white tip of a new tooth coming into place right where the canine tooth had originally been removed from. David. Malachi's teeth are regrowing. Well, that's impossible, we just had those removed. Alter entering the park. David quickly found a parking space close to the outhouses that were provided by the Bureau of Land Management. Quickly, after putting the car into park, David got out of the car and then opened the back seat door so that he could see Mariachi's teeth. Open your mouth real wide, Malachi. I want to see your new teeth. Following his dad's instructions, Malachi opened his mouth as far as he could possibly spread his jaws. Honey. Malachi's right. Both of the teeth are growing back, and by what I can see, they're going to be just the same as the ones that Dr. Knox just pulled. How could that be? Dr. Knox just pulled them only 2 weeks ago. With this answer she too got out of the car and then entered through the passenger side back door. Looking where her husband was pointing, she quickly covered her mouth as she realized that he was right. Within just a couple of days both of the teeth had completely regenerated themselves. This created some problems toward David and Karina. David had felt that the family dentist, Dr. Knox, didn't know what he was doing and didn't do his job right. Karina had felt that, and knew, that the growth of new teeth were part of the vampire history within their genetics. David had wanted to go back to Dr. Knox and make him redo his job for free, as Karina had just wanted the entire issue left alone, as she knew for sure that the vampire part 0F her son would be found out. In the end, Karina had talked David out of seeing the dentist again. He made a mistake once. He'll do it again. Karina reasoned. But are we prepared to deal with this for the rest 0F Malachi's life? David asked. We don't know what it's going to be for the rest of his life, honey, Karina said as she knew, herself, that it would be for the rest of his life. Soon weeks, and then months had gone by for David, Karina, and their son. During all of that time they did reach their goal of going sightseeing on every weekend. They had gone as far as seeing the saltwater taffy factory in Salt Lake City, Utah, to seeing the Mile High Flea Market in Denver. In early May of 2002, just 4 days prior to Malachi's 4th birthday, David and Karina had both decided that Malachi had to see the family doctor, Dr. Redding, and then the dentist again as well. Though they had felt that it was Dr. Knox's fault that the teeth had regenerated in Malachi's mouth, they also knew that they would need to be on top of their son's health before he would start kindergarten the following year. But Mom, I don't want to go to school. I want to stay home with you and Dad. Malachi, you still got another year to even worry about it. But when it is time for you to go to school you will go. David argued back. That's not fair, Malachi continued to pout. Why should I have to go to school? I didn't do anything wrong. Malachi. School isn't for people that do something wrong. School is for learning with. There will be other kids your age and then you'll have many friends to spend time with. I don't want friends. I just want to stay at home with you and Mom. Malachi persisted. Stop arguing, You will be going next year and you will enjoy it. And God knows that your mom and I will too. As they arrived at the clinic, Malachi had quieted down as he soon realized that, without prior notice, that he was going to the doctor's office. What are we doing here, Dad? While your mom is at work, you need to have an appointment with the doctor so that we know that you're healthy. David answered just as he was beginning to cool down from the argument with his son. Am I going to get a shot? Malachi asked with a look of worry on his face. Looking over towards his son, as the child was now old enough to sit in the front passenger seat. There might be a shot. But if you don't look at it, it won't hurt as bad. David reasoned. But all shots hurt, Daddy. Don't let them give me a shot. As he began to whimper, he also began to squirm in his seat, as if he was going to hide himself within the corner by the door. As they pulled in front of the clinic, Malachi had quieted down in hopes that maybe his father would forget about him. Okay, Malachi, let's go on in. As he said this, he had looked over towards his son and saw that the kid was scared. Come on now, it's gonna be alright. With this, David got out of the car and walked around to Malachi's door. Just as he was about to put his hand on the door handle, Malachi reached up and locked the door. Boy, you better open that door. I don't want a shot, Daddy. But you're gonna get a spanking if you don't open the door right now, Malachi. Without his son noticing, Dave had quietly popped the rear seat door open as he continued to talk to him about a possible spanking. Then right in the middle of a sentence, David quickly reached all the way around and pulled up on the lock of Malachi's door. Ha ha. It only took Dave about 10 minutes to wrestle his young son into the doctor's office after opening the door. Soon, however, Malachi was laying down on an examination table in Dr. Redding's office. Well, Dr. Redding started. We seem to have 3 problems. Malachi's body temperature is still low. As low as it was the day that he was born. His heart rate is up extremely high. That might be from me having to fight him to come into your office today. Dave interrupted. What? Dr. Redding said as he looked at his young patient. You didn't want to see me, Malachi? But you're one of my favorite patients. I am scared of shots though. I'm not scared of you, Dr. Redding. I'll tell you a secret, Malachi. If you close your eyes, relax the muscle in your arm, and pretend that it's only me pinching you, I bet it won't hurt very much at all. As David listened to the suggestion from the doctor to his son, it made perfect sense to him as well. Why didn't my doctor say that to me? David thought to himself. Whatever argument that you had outside, David, would not be enough to keep his heart rate up 30 minutes later. You see, your son's heart rate averages about 130 while everyone else's averages anywhere between 70 and 90. Also, when Malachi was born, his body temperature was 72.1. Right now it's only 73.1. This 73.1 seems to be his average. Now, I thought that I saw in his medical records that you had his canines removed on the top. As the doctor looked up from the medical records within his hands, he looked at David for an explanation. He did have them removed. Then about 2 weeks later, almost a year ago, they came right back. Both of them. By the time that the 3rd week had passed, they appeared to be fully developed. As if they were never removed in the first place. As David spoke, it sounded almost as though he was looking for a reason from Dr. Redding for the regrowth of the teeth. Well, I don't know what to tell you, David. All that I can really say is that you know how to get a hold of me if you run into any problems. Then, looking at Malachi, and you, sir, need to get your vitals right and don't be so scared of shots. Then, as he said this, he pulled 2 band-aids out of a overhead cabinet. They both had pictures on them. One had Scooby-Doo on it and the other had Tweety Bird on it. Now, which one of these do you like the most? Looking at them as Dr. Redding displayed the bandages, Malachi began to tremble and his voice automatically started to rise, as he knew that what was about to happen was the only thing that he had feared about this doctor or any other. No. I don't want either one of them. I don't want a shot. At this, David decided that it was time to hold his son so that they might be able to get out of the appointment as soon as possible. About 10 minutes later, David and Malachi had walked out of the office. Malachi, as he wiped tears off of his cheek, quickly jumped into the front seat of the car and put on his seat belt. Now, If you had done exactly what the doctor had told you to do, that would not have hurt at all, Malachi. Then, without receiving a response from his son, he looked over to the child as he attempted to hide his face by looking the other way. Malachi. Looking towards his dad. Yeah, Dad? I love you, buddy. I'm sorry for getting angry at you. I used to get scared of shots also when I was your age. I'm sorry. Then Dave reached over to Malachi. As they continued to drive and lightly hugged him. I love you too, Dad. I'm sorry for being bad. I'll try to do better next time. Once again David reached over to his son. This time, just picking up his hand and holding it, he repeated his own words, I'll love you, don't worry about it. Just as they started to head down the road, through downtown Craig, David suddenly heard a loud siren behind him. As he looked into the rear-view mirror, David saw a patrol car behind him with its red and blue flashing lights running. Pulling off of the side of the road and into the Safeway grocery store parking lot, he stopped and then rolled down his window. Then, looking out the window, at the patrol car, he saw Karina climbing out of the driver's seat. The sudden feeling of fear melted away and replaced with relief. What's up, honey? Oh, I was just wondering if the appointment went all right. Then, as she reached the front door of their car, she rested her elbows on the frame of the window. Well, there was no change in his vitals. Then, looking at Malachi, he did have a slight problem with getting the shot and blood draw today though. At this, Malachi once again tried to hide his face. Oh, that's all right. Maybe he'll get used to it when he get a little older, Karina said as she smiled at her son. Well, honey, I'm gonna be running a little late. About a half hour late today. I'll see you when I get home. Karina added and then reached in to give her husband a hug. After this she walked around to the other side of the car, opened the door, and then gave Malachi a hug as well. I love you, son. I love you too, Mama. After watching Karina leave, David and Malachi continued on up Finley Lane towards Mrs. Sanchez's house. The weather, for late May, was unusually warm there in Craig. The outside temperature was reaching nearly 95 degrees. Then, as David and his son pulled into the older woman's driveway, they had arrived just in time to see Mrs. Sanchez replacing the storm windows of the house with screens. Hi, Mom. How are you doing? Oh. I'm doing all right. Just trying to get the house unwinterized. I guess that you could call it that anyhow. LT seems that any other year I wouldn't be pulling these windows out until mid-June. Yeah. It's pretty warm out. Climbing back down the ladder that she had been using, she made an offer to David to have some coffee. I just brewed it. Also, I have some donuts that I bought from the deli just this morning. As she made mention of the donuts, she looked towards her grandson, who immediately jumped to attention. Yeah, Daddy. Let's have some donuts. Malachi pleaded as he held onto his father's hand. Well, all right. David had a habit of having a very soft heart when his son would become instantly excited about anything. Mom. You know, anytime that you need some of the work done around your house, that I would be more than happy to help you out. David. I know that you're more than willing to help me out. But the thing is though, is that you do a lot of work around here already. On top of that, you work full-time and you have a son to raise. Pausing for a moment, as she opened the door, she held the door open and watched David and Malachi both walked in. As David and Malachi walked into the kitchen, the smell of the freshly brewed tea quickly overwhelmed the odor of the colon that David had put on prior to Malachi's doctor appointment. Well, that coffee smells good. It seems that, even though we purchase the same brand, that it always smells much better at your house, Mom. As David said this, he pulled out 2 coffee cups and then a small juice cup for his son. Hey, Dad. Can I try some coffee? This had been the first time that Malachi had ever asked for coffee. The smell of the fresh coffee, of which he personally felt smelled the same as that at home, had reached his curiosity over a large period of time. Looking at Malachi with a strange look on his face, he asked, Are you sure, son? The coffee is hot. Yeah. Please, Daddy. Let me try some. I think that it smells good too. As Malachi begged his dad, he had also put his hands up in hopes that his dad would give him a cup. Well, David, Mrs. Sanchez interrupted. I don't see how it would hurt anything. Hell, if anything it would help calm him down a bit. I wish I thought of that before we went to his doctor appointment this morning. Mom, I swear that boy almost came unglued over a shot this morning. As he put the juice cup back into the cupboard, he pulled out another coffee cup in its place. Well, David. I'm sure that shots weren't your favorite thing as a child either. We all fear, at times, the thought of pain. That's regardless of who you are or what age. Looking down at his son as he handed him the cup, be careful, Malachi, that's very hot. Okay. Thank you, Dad, Malachi said, then carefully tilted the cup to take a sip. As both Mrs. Sanchez and David stared at Malachi, his eyes opened wide as the taste of the fresh hot coffee flowed over the young child's tongue. Oh. That tastes good, Daddy. And it's very hot. As Malachi said this, he quickly set the cup on the counter as he quickly realized that his father wasn't exaggerating about the hot substance. What happened with the appointment then? Mrs. Sanchez interrupted as she too sipped out of her cup or coffee. Well, about the same as any other appointment. Malachi's vitals are completely different than anyone else's. Very different. David repeated himself as he too began to drink his coffee and then paused. Mom. Why is it that it seems that of all the children in the world that Karina and I end up with that 1 in a million child that has to be completely different? Now, David. It's alright for your son to be different. That's what makes him special. You know, David. I grew up being very different from any of the other children around me. My father, my grandfather, and then my daughter. Pausing for a moment, she quickly bit her tongue as she realized that she was almost going to tell David about the family secret. Just be proud of your son, David. He's a good kid, and you know that he is. Looking down at his son, as he pulled out a chair from the table, he reached over and raked his fingers through the young child's hair. I know. He is a great kid. And I love him very much. As the words left his mouth, Malachi instantly looked up to him and grinned. I love you too, Dad. Then, after making himself comfortable, he quickly opened up the donut box that was on the table and pulled out a donut that had cream filling leaking out of the end of it. Here, Malachi. His grandmother said. Keep your hands clean. Mrs. Sanchez handed her grandson a small stack of napkins with the intent for him to refill the napkin holder that was empty in the center of the table. Instead of recognizing the hint, however, Malachi took the entire stack and wiped a smear of chocolate off of his chin. Honey. That wasn't what I had in mind for you to do with all of those napkins. Sorry, Nana, Malachi said as he quickly caught on and then placed the unused portion of the napkins into the container. You're all right, hun. After staying for about an hour and a half, David and Malachi headed back out to the car to go back to Ridgeview. Just as his mother-in-law had predicted, the coffee, 2 cups worth before they had left, had calmed Malachi down a lot. Dad. Are we going home now? Yep. But I think that you might stop and see Grandma and Grandpa Decla first. Daddy. I'm tired, can we just go home instead? Malachi seemed to be fighting just to keep his eyes open as he protested the visit to his grandparents' home. Well. David quickly decided that he could just call his mom and dad rather than actually visiting. Also, he too was getting a bit tired as well. Yeah, I guess you're right, bud, Daddy's tired too.